Okay.
There you go.
I'm going to apologize to everyone. I'm in a safe room, but not because of rockets this time, because I have young children at home, and it's the only kind of like safe place to hide from them. But I hope no one walks in because I can't tell.
New meaning to the term safe space.
Exactly. It's dinner, it's like the 6 p.m. Israel time. Loud time at home.
So where are we? It's 11:01, so I think we can get started. William, Rachel, that's okay?
That is great, and we have Ruben today instead of Rahel.
Oh, of course, I know that. Hi, Ruben, thanks for joining us. Well, thank you everybody for joining our Zoom today. It certainly is a very, very interesting time to be able to talk about the change in government in Israel. On behalf of Malcolm Hoenlein, William Daroff, and myself, we really appreciate your joining us. And today's comments are going to be on the record. And we're joined by two very informed commentators that we really look forward to hearing from. And first, we're going to hear from David Makovsky, who is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and Director of the Koret Project of Arab-Israel Relations. He's also an adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins Paul Nitz School of Advanced International Studies. In 2013 and 14, he worked in the Office of the U.S. Secretary of State, serving as a senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He's the author of numerous Washington Institute monographs and essays on issues related to the Middle East peace process and the Arab-Israeli conflict. And he's also co-author with Dennis Ross of the 2019 book, Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped its destiny, and the 2009 Washington Post bestseller, Myths, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America in the Middle East. We're also joined by Dr. Shira Efron. I'll give you her bio after David is finished. We're looking forward to having David's comments, maybe with a little more of a US perspective, and Shira maybe with a little more Israeli, but David, it turns out, is in Israel at the moment. So we look forward to hearing from both of you. So David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diane, and it's a delight to be with you, albeit virtually, and to share the Zoom stage with Shira, who I have a lot of respect for, and I want to just thank you, Diane, and I want to thank William and Carolyn for putting this all together. And to give you a sense of how I see things, it's never boring to be here, as all of you know, come here all the time. I hadn't been here for a while because of COVID. So it's been especially interesting. I got a lot of my research meetings ahead. So, but let me just give a sense of how I put it in a certain way, also into kind of an American context, if I can. I was watching it all in Hebrew unfold yesterday. It was very dramatic. I think the numbers were actually higher than the actual final number of 60 to 59 to 1. There was another up to 6 seats that I think Bennett and Lapid just didn't want to vote for the government because of some of the views of the joint list. I think they could have had a number of them if they needed them. And even the guy who abstained would have voted for them too. So I don't think it hangs by a hair, but people want to know, is this durable? What are the policy goals of the new government? What does it mean for U.S.-Israel relations? So those are some of the pieces I could talk about, and then I'm sure Shira will cover a lot of it. Then I look forward to the discussion with all of you. Policy goals, it seems to me, is apple pie and motherhood. Stick to consensus issues, avoid divisive questions wherever possible. But this is the Middle East, so there are curveballs, fastballs coming at you all the time. We'll get into that a little more later. But this is like, people know I like sports metaphors. So like you've had unity governments, I remember going back to 1984, but they tended to be from like the 30-yard line to the 30-yard line. This is almost end zone to end zone. This is really across the board. And therefore, it's a huge challenge to keep this together. As you know, the glue has been, the sense of antagonism to Netanyahu and a question of the vitality of Israeli institutions. But it just seems that for the United States, looking at this government, and I've been in touch with people at the White House and State Department, it seems clear there's a government that wants to reduce polarization, deal with post-pandemic economic relief, present a budget for the first time since 2018, focus on infrastructure, health, and education, maybe do some things on religion and state if possible, the role of local rabbis in dealing with conversions and the like. And I think in dealing with the U.S.-Israel relationship, both Bennett in his speech yesterday and Lapid in his remarks today, the focus on bipartisanship, and I think closer ties with the diaspora, maybe even seeing if they could revive the Kotel package if the Haredim stay outside the government, the ultra-Orthodox. So in some ways, at least in terms of approach and whether you agree with the president or not, I think it's Biden-esque in the sense of focusing on unity and trying to reduce the high temperature in the country and economic, COVID relief, infrastructure. This sounds very familiar to us as Americans. I think the administration, off the bat welcomed it. As someone inside the administration said, we just had our send button, we were hovering over the send button until we got the green light that the vote passed, and then we pushed the button within seconds. A warm statement, a phone call. I saw Kamala Harris tweeted today. There may be other things. There was a call with Biden, Blinken, and Lapid. Clearly, the early signal of the Biden administration is we want to work with this government. And I get people ask me, okay, well, how does this bipartisanship thing work? Like, how do they emphasize this? And I don't think they know yet. I think it's a work in progress. I do think there are parts of the coalition that could really speak to, parts of the Democratic Party in a way that I think would be intriguing. You have, Merav Michaeli, who's a feminist, is leading one of the parties, the Labor Party. You have Nitzan Horowitz leading Meretz Party. He's an LGBT activist. You have the whole Mansour Abbas piece of this, which is historic. He's a part of the coalition. He's not in the government per se. There are two non-Jewish members of the government, one Druze, one Arab, and you've got, I think, 8 Arabs in the coalition. You've got, 10 women cabinet ministers. I mean, there's a lot here that I think would be important, and whether it's fair or not fair, and I know there's a huge debate, I don't want to really get into it at this minute, but the association of the, Prime Minister Netanyahu with Trump, take that piece out, I think that might be 50% of it in terms of trying to build these ties. It's definitely not the whole thing. Another piece of this that I think that Israel can work with, and I've let's say in 10 different meetings I've had with Naftali Bennett over the years, and he says this publicly. I'm not disclosing anything. When he talks about what he called autonomy on steroids, when he talks about areas A and B. Now that's you could say it's only 40% of the West Bank, but it's where most of the Palestinians live. And he says, well, why isn't there a Marshall Plan for these people? Why can't more be done for them? A and B is not as controversial as Area C, where thanks to Zev Elkin of the New Hope Party, he wants to have 50 inspectors of the Defense Ministry or of the IDF or civil administration that make sure that there's no illegal building in Area C on the Palestinian side. But A plus B is not as controversial. And, could there be things here with the Gulf states? I think part of the problem is less the Gulf states, although I've talked to some Arab ambassadors in the Gulf about this. Part of it is also Abbas. He's still angry at the Emirates, believe it or not. A senior Israeli security official who still talks to Abbas said that to me, that he just can't get over it. But could there be some private sector initiatives that the U.S. Private sector could engage with in that regard in areas A plus B? I think this is an administration that is not looking to do final status. It's not looking to solve the conflict, as I like to say. 3 times the U.S. tried to hit the home run on this issue. The year 2000 with Bill Clinton, 2007 and 8 with Condoleezza Rice and Olmert, and then I was part of the team in 2013-14. Whenever you swing for the fences, I think these were noble efforts, but when you swing for the fences, you could strike out. Are there singles here? But this is not an administration that has seen that the Venn diagram between the Israelis and the Palestinians on these final core issues, the borders, the security arrangements, Jerusalem, refugees, Jewish state, mutual recognition of the character of each side, that these are overlapping. And the US is looking elsewhere. Except for the Iran negotiations, the Middle East has not been a tier 1 issue. So to what extent, if you could say if the administration's expectations are low, maybe you could say that's good. Less room for friction with the new government. But I do think there might be some who want to know, just from Bennett, we don't expect you to reach 2 states, but are you going to close the door on even that as an eventuality? And then it gets to me about what are the challenges? What are the things that could really hurt in the US-Israel relationship and could maybe even break apart the coalition? As I said, this isn't Switzerland here. You could try to say, I want this to be all about apple pie and motherhood, but there are developments in Gaza, in the Middle East that you can't control and that come at you. So I do think this is an issue. But I think, I just thought maybe I would point out 2 things in the US-Israel arena that I think could be an issue. One is the Vienna talks about Iran. It will be no surprise to people that I think a new Israeli government will not like this, but the question is going to be to what extent, when the president and the secretary of state say we want something longer, longer and stronger, a follow-on, a 2.0 Iran nuclear deal, the Israelis asked this question. On one hand, we're playing nicer in the sandbox. This isn't 2015, but we still have a gap. We don't know how you're going to get to 2.0 if you're going to front load the sanctions relief in 3 areas, which is access to Iranian assets abroad, restrictions on oil exports, the integration into the financial system. If they get all that for 1.0, just going back to 2015, what incentive, what leverage do the Iranians have and what leverage does the US have? But now it's going to be a bit harder because now you're going to have Bibi Netanyahu in the opposition. And so when he was playing nicely in the sandbox, no one questioned. But if he's now going to be goading Bennett from the outside, it will be interesting to see what happens. Bibi raised in his Knesset speech that there would be American pressure to stop doing covert actions in Iran. I don't see that happening. That's going to be a decision that the Israeli security establishment remains a security establishment, and I don't see a change there. But the whole Iran-Vienna thing, I think, is a challenge. And it gets back to the question on, is there a follow-on deal or is it a fantasy? And the second question is, to what extent are the outpost issues, this Eviatar and other ones that some of the settlers might have an interest in provoking to try to create friction. And with Bibi in the opposition, that question might come in greater saliency. So just to summarize this, because I don't want to take up time, of course, the administration wants to know, is this durable or is this a fly-by-night kind of thing? To me, the answer to that, I tend to, is going to be, there are those who say it's not durable. The first Gaza crisis, it breaks apart. The egos, you won't be able to keep the egos in check. Bibi and the opposition is going to be goading. It's going to be hard. Those who say, no, it might be durable because Bibi is the glue that will hold the government together from the opposition. Second, the leaders have crossed the Rubicon. It's not like Bennett can go back to where he was, and Saar might not be able to go back either, and Mansour Abbas might not be able to go back either, and nobody wants a 5th election. But I think the test will be if it's durable or not durable is if they could pass a budget in 2 months. I think if they pass a 2-year budget in 2 months, like they say, that would be a signal that this government has legs, that it has standing power. It might have an impact on the Haredi calculations, the ultra-Orthodox. Right now, they're completely in Likud's corner. They've been, firing brimstone at Bennett. But in 6 months from now, will they look at things different if they see that this government has it can last? So I think the budget for me is going to be a big signal domestically, but also in terms of the United States. But the U.S. approach is going to try to be, we want to work with you. And, and we know you want to do the bipartisanship part of this. We will love that. So I tend to think that in the short term, It's going to certainly be, there's going to be a lot of hope here. But again, it's the Middle East. I keep coming back to it. So when you have a fragile construct, the Middle East, you know, could fire a lot of fastballs and curveballs at you, and you have to be able to withstand that. And of course, needless to say, at the core here, the Lapid-Bennett relationship, or the Bennett-Lapid relationship, however you want to call it, that level of trust has to remain rock solid. There's so much else to talk about, but I don't want to take up time. I hope we can talk about Gaza and what, you know, how that figures into this, but I'm just worried about talking too long. So maybe I should turn it back and over to Shira, over to Diane, William, but I'm looking forward to the discussion. Oh, I think
Thank you very much, David. We appreciate it. We now have Dr. Shira Efron, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, a special advisor on Israel with the RAND Corporation, and an adjunct scholar at the Modern War Institute at West Point. Dr. Efron specializes in policy analysis, research, and planning methods that can be applied in a variety of contexts. Her studies are featured regularly in Israeli and international media outlets. And before joining INS, RAND, and MWI, Dr. Efron was a Middle East analyst at several think tanks in Washington, D.C., including the Center for American Progress and Middle East Institute. She's a member of the board of directors of Deborah Forum, which promotes women in the security establishment, and a policy advisor with Israel Policy Forum. Shira, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for having me today with David Makovsky, as a dear friend and mentor and somewhat an analyst I really appreciate. David said a lot of the things that I had meant to say, so it's a great compliment. A former colleague used to say, great minds think alike, and so do we. So David, you are a great mind, but I will try to shift a little bit, and then we can elaborate in the discussion in terms of what's happening. I think before we go into the different issues that could turn problematic with this government, I want to, if you don't mind, just speak about the good for a moment. The new government that I think from an objective perspective, right, having, guys, I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of a webinar. Can you, no, I need to be on here. I told you, not completely safe. I'm sorry. I need you guys out of here, both of you right now. Thank you. It's not here.
It's okay. We're pro-family, Shira. We're all about Jewish continuity, so we're fine to have you show us Jewish continuity front and center.
And we've all had moments like that, so don't worry.
Yeah, I know, but you would think 3 boys, he's not closing the door. Anyway, it'll be fine, you know. So I'll just say, I'll start with the good with this government. First of all, it has more female ministers, women, 9 out of 27, more than Israel has ever had. Israel and the previous government over the last decade, in terms of gender diversity, did very poorly, even on regional standards, like Lebanon did better. So this is a good thing. Also, many of the ministers are under the age of 50. I know it's standard in the United States, in Europe, in Israel, it's not. So there are like good things. And I think a lot of the domestic socioeconomic issues, the parties can agree on. It's true that the budget is political. Different issues are also political. However, there's a big agreement here between the different parties. On the other hand, as David said, the glue that holds them together is the sort of the Bibi or not to Bibi. As long as Netanyahu is the head of the opposition, they will stick together. I choose to be optimistic and to think that there will be more glues that hold them together for a long time, because Israel needs a stable government. In addition, the priority of this government is going to be a socio-domestic policy. It's not just because what Israel needs, it's what every normal country does, especially after a pandemic. A recent survey, I just got the data today, 95% of Israelis say they're concerned only about socioeconomic domestic issues. Only 5% of respondents, Jewish, Arabs, Haredi, across the board, said that foreign policy issues are of concern to them. So you need to understand where the public is. However, as we know, and David said, this is the Middle East. Excuse me, I'm sorry. This is. I apologize. It's worse than I thought. Um, this has never happened that I actually had to walk out. As we know, reality is going to occur. Foreign policy issues don't wait. And I think there are three key issues. David mentioned two of them, but I think there are three key issues that can come in between Israel and the United States. And I'll mention them. We'll discuss them in a different order, but I think the first one is obviously the Palestinian issue. Not a priority topic for the Biden administration, but still a topic, right? And when there's an occasional war, we see more involvement, maybe more involvement than desired on the US side, involvement that could be constructive, as I believe it was this time. But from different sides in Israel can be less constructive depending on what issues we talk about. There's tomorrow the flag parade in Jerusalem, the Shir Iraq, there's the Qatar, there are all the issues that David mentioned. Of course, second is Iran, return to the agreement and the regional activity of Iran, two different issues there. And the final one that David, I think, didn't mention, but I think is going to come as a major issue as well, is China, Israel's evolving ties with China, which happens to be really a bipartisan issue in the United States. Maybe I'll start with the China stuff. I don't know how much you've been following, but Israel since 2013 has deepened its ties with China extensively. In civilian domains, but as we know, the competition with China is not just military. Israel has joint innovation partnership with China, strategic partnership, a partnership in academic circles, the 7+7 universities. There are growing Chinese investments in infrastructure and Israeli technology. With the Trump administration, actually, those ties came to the forefront as Secretary Pompeo and John Bolton and others have warned Israel not to deepen its ties with China. Israel has, and I can say it even on the record because I wrote this, Israel has paid lip service to the U.S. concerns on China. It established a screening mechanism for foreign investments, but it has not addressed, even at the minimum, the U.S. concerns about the technological competition with China, because Israel's screening of Chinese investments in Israeli tech, the mechanism doesn't have in its mandate technology. It excludes technology. This is an issue that if you look at the Biden administration, the top priority is China. We see it now in reports from the G7 summit, obviously with the Europeans. The issue is technology. I think there's an opportunity with this new government, the Israeli government, to explain the US position and try to, I'm not saying to align them because Israel and the United States are not going to have the same perspective and policies vis-a-vis China, but for Israel to understand where the US is coming from. I think statements like Yossi Cohen, former head of Mossad, I don't know if you heard it, came out in Israeli press. I don't know what the Americans want from China. This is not something that's going to go well, and I hope that members of this new government and civil servants would not say anything like that can really raise the irk of Israel friends on both sides of the aisle. It is important to say that when the Haifa port found itself in the NDAA a couple of years ago, it was Tom Cotton who put it in. So it's a big friend of Israel, right? He's a big friend of Israel, and he was the one who put it in. I'll just tell you that at INSS, we did a bipartisan project with CNAS and FDD on how to let's say, how to make Israel work more with the US and align itself more with US policies, because this is a major issue. And I have some recommendations for that. The next one is Iran. David mentioned JCPOA, no JCPOA. I must say that many analysts, we thought that there will be a return to the agreement already. Zarif said a few months ago, he said, oh, going back to the agreement, it's not a problem. We know how the agreement looks like. What's the problem? We know the Americans, the Biden administration really wanted to go back to the agreement. The parties are starting the sixth round, 2 months, and there are a lot of very, very serious gaps. We don't know. There are elections in Iran. hardliners are becoming stronger. Iran has reached very dangerous milestones with enrichment to 63% uranium. There are other indicators that the sanctions have not had their desired effect. Iran learned to cope with the sanctions, and also to they're very creative with their autonomy, turning east, diversifying their markets. So the sanctions are not as effective as we would like to be. And there's an assessment in Israel that there's no other diplomatic way to contain Iran, but more of the same, which has not led to a change of behavior. On the other hand, there's consensus across the board that the JCPOA does not, the nuclear agreement with Iran doesn't address Israel's concern. Netanyahu was so dominant on the Iran file that it's going to be very interesting to see how the Bennett-Lapid government are going to deal with it. You know, for Netanyahu, Iran was a religion. For them, it's a major issue, but it's an issue. It's the biggest issue. Clearly, it's the biggest strategic threat on Israel's security. But they understand, and I think Benny Gantz is the same, they don't want to pick a fight with the US. They understand the need to solve differences discreetly. They understand that it's almost a fait accompli. If the US and Iran are able to go back to an agreement, Israel will have to live with it. And it's better, instead of trying to derail an agreement, to work on the assurances, monitoring paradigms. As David said, what is going to be this, like, make the deal better and longer? What does it mean? Are we ever going to get to the second stage? And if not, what does it mean? Israel is also preparing for what if there is an agreement and what if there's no agreement. If there is an agreement with Iran, it's going to hinder Israel's ability to act in the region and in Iran itself. You know, all these mysterious cyber attacks, power cutouts in different nuclear facilities, right? If, according to foreign reports, Israel was responsible for them, Israel will have a very difficult time doing these things if and when an agreement is reached. On the other hand, I think that Israeli strikes in Syria to prevent transfer of weapons and other a buildup of Hezbollah, and also Iranian established entrenchment in Syria and Iraq. I think the U.S. will give Israel freedom of action. So that's but everything will have to be very discreetly, and which brings us to the Palestinians. On the Palestinians, clearly not an issue, as we said, but there is a situation here. The U.S. wants to, the Biden administration wants to reverse some of the steps that the Trump administration enacted. We have the consulate in Jerusalem, talks about reopening the PLO mission in Washington. There are talks about Gaza. I think there's a lot of fantasy talk about Gaza. We can go into this in a moment. Normalization, I don't think the US is going to go for it. In terms of Israel, where you look at the coalition agreements, you see something about safeguarding construction in Area C, but it doesn't say if it's by the Jewish settlers or the Palestinians, so it depends on the eye of the beholder. Some agreement on transportation. It would be very difficult for this government to do steps in the Palestinian arena that could upset Washington. On the other hand, and as David said, I think there could be a sweet spot for this government to do things that would benefit the Palestinian people, that would be in line with what the Biden administration wants to achieve. This Venn diagram that David spoke about, in areas A and B, there's a list of things that can be done. And maybe I'll end with that, and we'll go to other we'll go to your questions and other issues.
Okay, great. Well, I just want to remind everybody to use the raise hand function if they have a question, and I'll go ahead and get started. It's interesting that both of you really said, and has been broadly reported in the press, that the focus is going to be domestically. And Shira, your statistic of the poll that says that's what really 95% of the Israeli population wants. One somewhat surprising aspect of the recent operation in Gaza was that we had a fair amount of conflict in the so-called mixed cities like Lod, where we visited, and Ramlah. How do you think the new government can address some of the underlying issues involved there? And do you think that is an area where they might focus? I don't know which one of you would like to start.
Shira, you want to start on that?
You could go.
Well, the mixed city thing, we don't know enough. I don't know enough. I feel I talked to a U.S. government official.
Hi.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Sorry, someone might not be on mute.
Somebody's not on mute. If everybody could please
I'm
mute their
good.
line. We're getting children and some background noise, please.
Look,
Thanks.
I don't. So I've been trying to probe this thing, and maybe in 2 weeks, if we could talk, I'll have a better sense. There's you hear some people say, look, you had, there was like some gang members from the outside. Will be some people say that. Others will say no. These were some of these areas. There was an agitation of people of the mosques who heard things that maybe the Israeli public didn't hear on the Temple Mount about, I don't know, microphones being cut off and Leil al-Qadr, and they kind of agitated there. Others will say, no, in Ramla and Lud in particular, there was these people moving in a certain part of the town that were clearly coming from the outside that got the Arabs to think that their homes were at stake. Every town might be different. And what I'm struck by, and maybe you could say both Shira and I are the optimist types, but I was talking to a Jewish woman who lives in Jaffa and said, David, look in the windows in Jaffa and you'll see signs that says called Misarvim Liot Oivim. We refuse to be enemies. And it's very heartening. And it makes me wonder, is the agitation just coming from a small minority? I talked to others, another Jewish, young couples that become very popular, young couples to live in Lud. They said, look, in their part of town, they didn't even hear about this. It was nothing near them. I don't know if we're talking about a minority in some of these cases, but even so, even if that is the case, and that's what you hear, that they're just minorities, I think the majority needs to assert itself and focus on coexistence. I mean, to me, and I was thinking of writing a piece about this, when Hania, of the Palestinian, of Hamas, speaks at a rally in Qatar, in Doha, during the Gaza crisis. And the thing he's most proud of is we killed coexistence in Israel. Imagine that sentence, that this is what Hamas is proud of, that they killed coexistence. And let's not give Hamas a victory. Let the silent majority assert itself that it has a stake in coexistence, regardless of your political views. And if this government, by bringing in Arab members, there's 8 out of the 60 or so that are Arab members, but I think this is somewhat an answer, a rebuke to Hania, about killing coexistence. Let's reassert coexistence more. Again, this isn't about giving up land, okay? I'm not talking about the Palestinian issue in the West Bank. I'm just talking about Jewish-Arab coexistence. I think this would be an important rebuke to Hania and show the difference between Israel that wants coexistence and Hamas that is one pride of achievement is that they quote killed coexistence. But I don't know, Shira might have different thoughts.
Yeah, Shira, do you want to add something?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, during COVID, there was kind of I was way more optimistic about internal Israeli Arab, Jewish Arab relations inside Israel. I don't know if you know, but the Arab community is more represented within medical teams and the medical sector than its share of the population, physicians, nurses, pharmaceuticals. So, when you're all in a crisis in the hospitals, it's one thing when we know there's real coexistence, right? People go to the best physician. Most people go to the best physician, no matter what their ethnic or religion is. There was also something that we have to give credit to Benjamin Netanyahu for. He passed a budget of allocating 15 billion shekels for investment in Arab towns and cities, understanding that you have to integrate them better into the economy and society. So this was really shocking. I'm telling you, living here, even our gardener, he didn't come for like 2 months. And I said, what happened? He said, because of the mess, the balagan. I'm like, are you kidding with me? And it's like, I don't know. I was scared. We live in the suburbs of Tel Aviv. So just to give you how close to home this got. On the other hand, again, the same survey that I mentioned today, you look and most respondents, Jewish respondents, do feel that this was a small minority of extremists. On the other hand, there's also, and we have to say it, on both sides, you have thugs that have lit up the fire, right? And the Israeli side, on the Israeli side, you can argue that the Jewish side, they were more organized. There were buses coming from different cities. The lynch in Bat Yam was not organized by Bat Yam. It was like Lahava coming with buses from Jerusalem. So it was more organized. So there are two sides to this. And people seem to have moved on in Israel. And I hope this was temporary. I hope people saw how dangerous it is domestically for the fabric of the society. And we see that there's like kabdeu and chashdeu. If you know Hebrew approach to this in the poll, it's like proceed cautiously, but proceed. There's no Israel saying, oh, punish the Arabs. Only those that they see. If you participate in lynch, you have to be treated like a criminal or a terrorist, which makes total sense. I agree with David. I think the inclusion of an Arab party, not the Arab, I think there are different Arab parties, right? And they chose the Arab party that has different approaches to Zionism and to Islamism, but there's an Arab party in the Knesset. It's a good thing. Part of the agreement is further integration of them into the economy and society, and this is welcome. It should be continued with budgets. And I think Mansour Abbas, the head of the Ram party, one of the reasons why he's not going to make any, he has all incentive for this to succeed, right? That's why he's going to stay in the government. That's why I understand next Operation Gaza. So what? What's going to happen for him? It's to either it's over survival. He has to show success, and the way for him to show success is to show better integration into society and the economy for the Arab sector as a whole. So I'm still optimistic.
I just want to add a basis of our optimism. We both see polling data of young Arabs that want more integration. They see Israel as a success story. They think the old guard approach of just, thundering from the podium against Israel has not brought much. When you think of what Mansour Abbas, he was focusing on individual services. Don't we deserve more police protection? We have a lot of Arab on Arab crime. He spoke to an Israeli public as saying he's right about services. And I just think that his ability to tailor his message, focus on individual, services for individuals, not questioning the Jewish character of the state, like maybe some other parties. I think this was very smart. And also, I think it reflects also the young Palestinian Israeli Arabs who say, we want Israel as a success story economically. And the old approach of just being a minority and just staying in our ghetto away from Israel, it hasn't done well for us. And we want a different approach. So that makes me optimistic that I do think when you have the younger people with you, I think that according to the polls, I think that is a hopeful sign. Doesn't mean there's not a lot of work ahead, but I do think this is a hopeful sign.
I'll also, if I may add to this, because I think we always take the Israelis like state perspective, but I think also the Arab youth, they're also in themselves a success story. You look at the number of female students in the Technion. There are more Arab female students in the Technion, which is the Israeli MIT, than Jewish ones. There are positive things happening. And I must say also with the Abraham Accords, I think there's more potential for the Arab Israelis to benefit from these agreements than for the Palestinians. I know, David, you wrote about it. I'm trying to write about it. It's going to be harder to bring the Palestinians on board for objective reasons, trade, what do they manufacture? But for the Arab Israelis, there are opportunities here. So yeah, but it's clear that they have sentiments also toward Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that they can also want to be Israeli and integrate better, but they also have a Palestinian part of their identity. And the Israeli government can acknowledge that. It's not, I don't see it as a weakness. I would see it as a strength.
Okay, thank you very much. Ruben, next question, please.
The next question is going to be from Bob Sugarman, past chair of the Conference of Presidents.
Hello, David and Shira. Thank you very much for your expert analysis. It's nice to see you both. I have two questions, actually. One on Iran. Last week, I read that the administration lifted sanctions on 3 individuals and some companies. It was unclear what the companies were and what impact that would have. So to the extent you can comment on that. And the second part of that question is, one would think that if Bibi was still the prime minister, he would be shouting from the rooftops about the US caving to Iran by releasing sanctions, even in advance of Iran agreeing to come back to compliance. What will Bibi be doing as the opposition, and what impact, if any, will it have on the Bennett Lapid government? And the second question is totally different area, and that is the 2-state outcome. And in my view, the status quo is not really sustainable, but you have 2 really decidedly different attitudes. The Bennett's, our attitude of annexation, and the Lapid and Mikhaeli and other attitude toward 2-state outcome. David mentioned that Bennett has said things in the past. What do you envision happening on that front?
Good. I want to start, Shira. Look, Bob, it's always good to see you, first of all, albeit virtually, and I hope to see you in person not too distant future. Look, you put your finger on the 2 things that are really at the center that Shira and I think really could, have a real impact on, in terms of, impacting the government, impacting U.S.-Israel relations. So let's start with the Iran issue. I want to just zoom out for a second on this one, because I really think, from what I've been hearing, talking to people who follow the Ayatollah, it's about classes of sanctions. There are 3 baskets, 3 categories, and they all are about hard currency when you think about it. As I try to say in my opening remarks, there's the reintegration into the world financial system, their access to banks, their access to their assets abroad, like locked in South Korean or all sorts of banks that they can't repatriate. And there's the restrictions on their oil exports. These are the 3 big things. There might be this individual here, this individual there who's designated by the Treasury for whatever reason. And, there's sanctions and there's sanctions. But I mean, I want to keep my eye on the ball. I'm looking at these 3 big categories. And I am concerned a bit that if all 3 categories are released early as part of 1.0, returning to 2015, I think, the Conference of Presidents or any group in the US and Israel would be welcome to, say, okay, tell me, how do we get to the longer and stronger that the president and the Secretary of State say they want, the follow-on deal? And I think the administration, at a certain point, there's a certain obligation on it to say, this is what we mean by longer and stronger, longer sunset clauses on enrichment, longer, ballistic missiles, R&D on centrifuges, inspection access in some of these big things. And this is how we think we have the leverage to get there. At a certain point, if the administration can articulate what longer and stronger means, and I think Tony the Secretary of State was having some, was on the Hill last week, and he was being pressed both by the House and the senators. Longer and stronger. What does it mean? Longer and stronger. What does it mean? Longer and stronger, longer and stronger. So, I think the administration really has to make its case on that, because if it doesn't, people will say this is a one and done strategy. This is just focused on getting back to 2015 and then checking it off the list and going off the climate change or China or other very worthy objectives, I should add. So I think it's up to the administration on this. I think with Bibi though in the opposition, you know, when he was prime minister, nobody was goading him. He played nicely in the sandbox with the president, you know, and up till the day before, I think that Lapid was able and Bennett could announce their numbers. So I think we're seeing a change of tone before our very eyes, and just within a week. And the Knesset speech yesterday, it started at the Mossad handover thing from you know, Yossi Cohen to Dedi Barnea, and then yesterday's speech. So I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on Bennett and Lapid, because he's going to shine a lot of Klieg lights on them in a way that they didn't shine on him. Because as Shira said, this was, because this is, I believe the prime minister, you know, I believe Netanyahu on this, that he says, this is why I get up in the morning, he says, this is why I walk, this is why I do what I do. I think this was the be all and end all. So I think, you know, I think people, I think Bennett and Lapid are going to say, what is this longer and stronger? And how do we get there? How do you get from A to B? I think that's going to be a huge thing. And there needs to be, it's not just on Israel on this one. It's on the White House and the State Department. And I'm sure you guys are working on this. I think they need to articulate what that follow-on negotiation is like, or else people will say it's a fantasy and it's not real. And that will hurt the administration's credibility. So that's on that first cluster of questions of Bob's. The second cluster about I think the Palestinian issue about am I right if Bob, your question about right on the two-state outcome and where does it go? I said that I don't think the administration is expecting a two-state outcome. What they don't want, though, is to close the door on a possibility that someone else could reach a two-state. I think if Bennett would come with his autonomy on steroids concept for A plus B, I think they would welcome him. I can't speak for the administration. They won't, you know. I personally think, if we didn't really talk about this yet, but you know, there's the deepening of the Abraham Accords and there's the broadening of the Abraham Accords. Deepening is, what do you do with the countries you already have a normalization with? And the broadening is, could you include Saudi Arabia, which is the big prize? Could you imagine this administration trying to reach out more? I mean, Bennett has said, Bob, on the issue of annexation publicly, this is public. He said, I respect what the prime minister did, where he, you know, that's the law of the land. Basically, 4 years, we cannot raise annexation. That was our commitment to President Trump. So I don't think Bennett is going to reverse that. But I am concerned a bit that Netanyahu in the opposition is going to, like I said, try to throw as many curveballs and fastballs as he can. So I can imagine a whole series of legislation, death, you know, mandatory death for terrorists. Now, why didn't he do it when he was prime minister? Or annexation in the West Bank? He's the one who gave the commitment to Trump for 4 years. So, you know, and to the Emiratis. And, you know, he doesn't talk about that a lot publicly. But I could imagine a whole series of moves by Netanyahu in the opposition that Netanyahu would not have done as prime minister. But, you know, when you don't have the responsibility, suddenly you could say a lot of different things. So I am concerned about that in that regard.
Shira, do you want to add anything there?
You know, I'll just talk about the Palestinians. I don't know what Netanyahu will do. I'm a little bit concerned about sort of keeping the partisanship and, you know, with midterm in the US in 2022 and turning this JCPOA again to such a political issue, right? It's not just a security issue. So this could happen. On the Palestinian side, I'll say, listen, annexation. I mean, Bob, I'm with you on that. I think they're opposing views, and for Bennett's end game is the autonomy on steroids, right? The Area C is a red line. I think the autonomy on or advancing, having positive steps in areas A and B should not be adopted as an end game. This could be just an interim step in the middle. But, you know, there's an advantage to this coalition government, and the fact that you have the Biden administration, an advantage from my perspective, and I think David's also, that you have the Biden administration in the US, that I don't think this government is going to do anything that could endanger the two-state solution further than it is today. So of course, no annexation. But I think even other things, small things, we've already seen. They're trying to, Merav Michaeli is all questioning different plans that Mir Regev, former transportation minister, approved in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. There are different things. First, because that could break the government apart, and they don't want that. Not now. Okay, let's say not in the near future. And second, no one wants to get into trouble with the United States and the Europeans, by the way. The European angle was very neglected in the past few years, but there's understanding, and Lapid knows it very well, and he's also developed a really close personal relationship with Macron of France. They understand that Europe is still Israel's #1 trade partner. It's still an important, sort of as a continent, right? The EU, but also individual European countries. Threatening annexation is not the best way to get the Europeans on your side. So,
can I just add one more thing just to reinforce what Shira said, that I really think if you had a situation of Bennett and Lapid saying, look, we got to work within the zone and we got to keep things in bounds, and to talk to the administration, like, we're not going to surprise you. These are things we're going to do within the blocks, within the barrier. That's where 85% of the Israelis over the green line live, in the blocks, within the fence. That's where they live, and that's where our focus is going to be. To the extent that, I think this distinction between settlements that are inconsistent with the prospects even of two states and those settlements that are not inconsistent with two states, I think that's a distinction that I can imagine these two guys discussing more. And, how Bennett finesses this will be interesting. I think that the analytical point beyond the policy stuff that Shira and I love to deal with, I think that there's a big picture question that is probably too soon to be asked, but is to what extent does Bennett view what is his political self-identity? Does he see himself, he clearly sees himself as coming from the right. Is that where he wants to go? Is he going to be able to go back to that? Or does his base kind of morph to a centrist base where he's actually competing with Lapid and Gantz, for those voters? Is that going to change? Because it could be, and I don't know this, and this is one of the questions I want to find out on my trip, and it might be too soon to ask, but to what extent does his conception of himself politically as being more of a centrist leader shape his policies? Because if his views are, look, I'm from the right, I'm going back exactly where Netanyahu is, we're going to compete head on for the right-wing voters, he might have one set of policies. If he's saying, no, I'm going to, he said yesterday in the Knesset, to compromise, I think he said, is not a sin. He wasn't talking about territory, I want to be clear. But to what extent does his very American kind of attitude about looking for the middle, to what extent does it shape his political identity? Because if you have a sense of his political identity, it might give you a sense of his policies. Now, it might be too soon to ask that question. Sometimes when you're flying an airplane and, they when the plane lands, the stewardess says, be careful when you go to the overhead luggage, because sometimes things shift in flight. So we don't know if his political identity is going to shift at all. But I think answering that question might unlock a few other questions too.
Yeah, I mean, maybe
Okay,
just
you know what? We have a number of additional questions. Can you give us a few more minutes or
Sure,
not?
no, I'm happy to.
Shira?
Just a few more because I have to.
You have to go, I understand.
The little one,
So-
but yeah, sure, another 10 minutes.
So that would be great. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to ask the questioners to be short, and I'm going to ask each of you to be short so we can get to 2 or 3 more people, if that's okay. So Ruben, go ahead with the next question, please.
The next question is going to be from Mort Klein of ZOA.
Thank you very much. Great to hear your insights. My quick question is, you're talking about a Palestinian state solution. Am I incorrect that we should finally understand that the Palestinian-Arab war against Israel is really not about land or statehood. Ehud Olmert told me Abbas wouldn't sign because he wanted to delete the clauses saying he accepts Israel as a Jewish state, no further claims, and then no refugees moving into Israel. And for 12 years, Abbas has refused to even sit down with Netanyahu. Isn't it time to realize land and Palestinian statehood is not going to resolve this? That's not what they're interested in. It's Israel's destruction. And we have to look at some alternative to a Palestinian state solution.
Look, Mort, you and I might, respectfully have some differences. I really try to look a lot to the security establishment people here in Israel that I really trust, whether they're in the Shin Bet, whether they're in the IDF chief of staff. Gadi Eisenkot was a visiting fellow at my institute. I was just with him at his house last week for 4 hours. I sat with him for every single day for 6 months. They have resources I don't have. And when I hear from these guys who I trust that they see the distinctions, then I usually tend to believe that, I take that really seriously. Now, that doesn't mean that you're wrong, that a final status deal could be done tomorrow. I don't believe it could be done tomorrow. I'm not in what I call the home run school. I just don't think the Venn diagram here overlaps. And I don't think we should try it. I don't think to strike out a fourth time is not a good idea. I think there could be singles. I just don't see them all as one politically homogenous group of people. That's where maybe you and I might have respectfully some differences, but I tend to take very seriously what I hear from the security establishment people. But operationally, where you and I may agree is that there's no grand deal tomorrow morning. And that has to be a point of departure. And I think that realistically, it wasn't going to happen. The Biden administration isn't pushing for it, and the Israeli government isn't pushing for it. And Abbas can't do those final things now anyway. So I tend to think that we shouldn't be thinking in final status terms at this time. My point is a distinction between, ending the conflict versus purely managing the conflict. I think you could take a middle position of shrinking the conflict by trying to do some singles and doubles. But I tend to look for guidance for a lot of these security establishment people who this is their 24/7 job, is to follow this stuff. So if they draw these distinctions, I do take that seriously. Anyway, Shira might have other thoughts.
You know what, I'm gonna, in order to get all the questions in, I'm gonna go to the next question, and hopefully that's one where maybe Shira can begin. So Ruben, next question, please.
The next question is going to be from Ralph Seliger of JLC.
Thank you. Dr. Efron mentioned something in passing, if I'm remembering correctly, that the new government has some fantasy ideas about Gaza. So I was just wondering what kind of perspectives this new government might have toward Gaza, and whether there be any differences from the Netanyahu government on that.
Yeah, well, it's not a short issue. I didn't mean to say that the new government has a fantasy about Gaza, because I don't know what the new government has or has not. They just sworn in yesterday. They don't have advisors yet. But the Israeli sort of analytical establishment community believe that Israel should not allow the transfer the entrance of anything into Gaza through Kerem Shalom, which is the main crossing, until the bodies of the soldiers are returned. And as to others, unless we're talking about humanitarian stuff, I'll tell you that humanitarian for Israel and humanitarian for those countries that invest in Gaza are different. For now, everyone's giving Israel sort of, it's after a war. No one's pressuring Israel, but the desalination plant that the European Union has invested $1 billion in, it requires scuba diving gear, it requires steel pipes, it requires things that Israel doesn't want to bring in, but it is considered humanitarian because it's water. Those arguments are going to continue. So I think Israel is, I personally think it's better not to have these red lines and say we're not going to do this unless this, because then when you violate what your own promises, it puts you into trouble. The other thing is everyone in Israel suddenly realized that Israel has been paying protection to Hamas all these years, and it's protection payments, and it's on the record, so I can't even tell you the negotiations with Hamas facilitated by Qatar, but it's protection to Hamas with Qatari money, but so much of the focus has been on the Qatari origin of the money, but not on the destination. So it's like, oh, we'll stop the Qataris, we'll bring the Emiratis in. Someone mentioned it, I think it was David. David mentioned it earlier that Abbas is still mad at the Emiratis. Well, guess what? The Emiratis are still mad at Abbas. They don't want to put anything in Gaza that benefits Hamas or benefits the PA. And for a long time, they didn't want to put anything in Gaza that benefits Israel. What we heard is, sure, we will put money into Gaza. How much is Israel putting? We will double it. So I think this is when we talk about fantasy, we have to be more focused. The second thing is, and I'll just finish with that. There's enthusiasm now that Egypt is taking a more active role in Gaza. Finally, we can push Israel, Gaza to Egypt. I spoke to Egyptian diplomats. They're like, no, this is not your wet dream. We're not taking over. This is a captive market. It can benefit us economically. There's a posture vis-a-vis the United States. This is something that signals to the United States that Egyptians are important. But in terms of what goes in through Egypt, there's still smuggling. The gate, there are gates that are not monitored. And for all these things, I'm not talking about construction of 9 towers. That's not a problem. If cement goes through Egypt, it's been going on through Egypt for a long time. By the way, also through Israel. But for all these dangerous things that Israel is afraid of, I think it's better if it goes through Israeli security standards. And that's why everyone's talking about changing a paradigm, but I don't think we're changing it so quickly.
Okay, thank you. Ruben, next question, please.
The next question is going to be from Malcolm Honline.
Yeah, thank you both very much. I wanted to ask first, is Israel putting itself in a position of being blackmailed by Hamas every time any move takes place in Jerusalem? We see it in regard to the parade, regardless of what your feelings are about it, that this creates a circumstance and underscored by both comments from Hezbollah and Hamas, but particularly Hamas, that will bind any future government decision or influence it. And second, we see the satellite sale by Russia to Iran, despite some Putin denials, but it seems it's too detailed not to be true. What do you sense Iran's direction? Is it after the election? Will they become more aggressive in the talks? Will they be more aggressive in trying to build up the resistance in the region?
All right. Look, the first question I think I saw today that Omer Bar-Lev, the new police minister, said the march is going through tomorrow, and it'll even be partly in the Muslim quarter. Omer Bar-Lev, just to remind people, is in the Labor Party. His dad is the famous Chaim Bar-Lev from the Six-Day War. Also, I guess you could say the Bar-Lev line. But so I don't think Israel is going to agree to being blackmailed at all. I agree with Shira that, look, the issue of Gaza reconstruction is complicated. No one wants Hamas to be able to claim a victory. I don't think in the Arab world either. To me, the place to begin is to understand where did the cement come from for this metro tunnel? 90% now of the rockets are homemade, is what Gadi Eisenkot told me. You know, we're not in the era that I was in 2014, where you used to have tunnels and smuggling of tunnels from the outside. Now there's underground sensors. So much of it is homemade. So how is this stuff made? Where does it come from? And then I think you could see where you could tighten up. But I don't think the idea, no one wants Hamas to come out. I would say nobody, but the idea of Hamas coming out ahead is something that it's not just Israel doesn't want it. I don't think Egypt wants it, but they don't want to be seen on the wrong side of being humanitarian. Maybe Sinwar thinks he did well in this round because of the fights in Lud that I was saying before. But I think that thought needs to be given to Malcolm's question. How do you make sure that Hamas does not be somehow emerge? You don't want it to be the guardian of Jerusalem in any way. You don't want it to be vindicated in any way. There's got to be a lot of thought here on this. I don't have great answers. Part of the problem is look, the dirty secret that no one wants to talk about is there's been 4 rounds with Hamas, 2008, 9, 2012, 2014, and now. and nobody has disarmed Hamas. No one is going in on the ground. Prime Minister Netanyahu was the prime minister on 3 of those 4 occasions. And if nobody wants to disarm Hamas, Abbas doesn't want to go in because it's dangerous. And therefore, no one's going to pour billions of dollars into this. And that means you're left with bad options. And we have to be honest about those bad options. Unless someone wants to disarm, but I just think Israel doesn't want to send 18-year-olds to do that because you'll lose a lot of kids and you have to reoccupy Gaza, and it could take years, and that could have impact also on the way Israel is seen in America. So, but once you take that off the table, you're left with bad options. So how do you make sure Hamas doesn't get credit? Are all you doing just trying to have longer intervals between the rounds under the name of deterrence? I think these are fair questions, and I wish my answers were better. But I think that if we're very blunt with ourselves, I think we need to realize it. And also a long-term truce with Gaza might not be the solution either. They might use the quiet to build more and more rockets, homemade, and more metro tunnels. So first there's got to be an after damage assessment on how the diversions were done, and how do you clean that up? How do you tighten it up? But I agree with Malcolm. The idea should be that Hamas does not emerge as somehow the guardian of the Palestinians. And the fact that the march is going ahead, to me, is also a sign that Israel doesn't want to allow that to happen. And this is under a Labor Party police minister.
If I can,
I think, Shira, we'll go to the final question, if you don't mind, from William Daroff.
Oh, sure, there was an Iran question. That's why there was an Iran part of the question.
Okay, go ahead. William, maybe you want to wrap the Iran question in, or?
Sure, and Shira, feel free to respond to my question however you wish. So let me thank you both for joining us and for all that you do to help increase understanding of this complicated region. My question is a sort of simple Tocklesy one, which is with Bennett and Lapid having different ideological backgrounds and outlooks on the world, how do you see them conducting foreign policy on behalf of the new government? And Shira, we can add in as it relates to Iran, but in general, how do they balance that, where the prime minister is to the right of the foreign minister, and how they conduct foreign policy? What have you heard while you've been here, and how do you think that will play out? And again, thank you both very much.
Sure. So I'll just say this is on the record, so I won't talk about it, but I have a lot of data on how stuff gets into Gaza, which also informs the diversion stuff. So David, we can talk off the record, but a lot of it is that Israel's responsibility, and not just for the crossings, but there's a lot of deflection of blame over the UN and stuff, which I really think is not right, just because I have the data. On Iran, just because there was a question before Malcolm asked, I'm really concerned. We're looking at the presidential elections there, and if you look at the candidates that were disqualified, it tells you a lot. Ali Larijani, he's sort of the flesh of the revolution. He's conservative, and he was disqualified also because they can't trust him 100%. Everyone is preparing for the supreme leader over the course of like the next 8 years to disappear from the scene, although Shia clerics have long lives. Everyone in this region have long lives, but there's real concern that they're going to go to be more hawkish. However, this is more on the domestic front. I will tell you that in terms of the negotiations on the JCPOA, back then in 2015, it's only the decision of the supreme leader. And in 2015, no one knew if he was going to do it until the last minute. And now it's the same situation. So you hear people saying from 40% to 75%, and then within what conditions, I think Biden administration wants to go in, but they also have their red lines, right? So very concerning. On Lapid and Bennett, we can't say yet because they just started. And again, the focus is not going to be foreign policy. I think they're going to minimize friction on foreign policy issues. They're just going to try to not deal with that, do no harm on one hand. And when faced with challenges, and this will depend on when we're talking about, it's the first year or so, Netanyahu is still heading the Likud party, right? There's still this trial. They have an incentive to stick together. It could erode over time. In terms of advisors, it's too early to say. Bennett chose Shimrit Meir, who is a journalist, considered a right-wing journalist with no professional government experience as his diplomatic advisor. For the National Economic Council, he chose an economist who's considered really a neocon in all terms, like much more right-wing than Netanyahu. Netanyahu himself, you could argue, that wasn't so right in his behavior, right-wing, right? He was giving cash out to people during COVID, paying protection to Hamas, very cautious on the Palestinian fight, didn't annex territory, didn't build new settlements during his tenure. So I'm not sure if there's going to be more ideological divide here, but it is, I think, a little bit too early to say. I don't know if David agrees.
I'll just say quickly that I do think the security establishment might fill some of the gaps where, let's say, Netanyahu was more dominant on Iran, that they'll look more to the security establishment for their assessments. In a way, Netanyahu kind of sucked a lot of oxygen out of the room on Iran. And here they're going to want to know what is the assessment, and that could become the common denominator that everyone will rally around. I tend to think on a lot of the foreign policy, there's agreement. There might be some optical things. Maybe Lapid will welcome the EU envoy to Israel in a way that Bibi didn't. I don't think that's going to change the world. Maybe on the Eastern Europeans that will have sensitivity for the American Jewish community and other parts. Those relations might not be as warm with Hungary and Poland the way they were. Brazil, actually in another part of the world. I don't think the Putin relationship is going to change much because, as Shira said correctly, the gray zone war, in Syria is something that Israel is going to pursue, no matter who's the government. And so that, the U.S. doesn't handle that relationship anymore with Putin. So Israel's going to have to maintain that. So I don't know if I see such huge differences here. Both Bennett, no less than Lapid, wants to focus on bipartisanship. Bennett mentioned that. I don't know if I see such huge fights. And I know I'm sorry if I'm letting some people down here, but I don't think they have much to fight about really in this area. The areas that are controversial is like Shira and I say, which is the Palestinian issue in certain terms on the outposts and some of these other places, not closing the door to two states, and how you deal with Vienna. I really think Vienna is a big one. I really do. I think that's, if there's no clear plan about a follow-on talks, I'm a bit concerned. But I put more of the onus on the administration, frankly, to tell people its pathway of what longer and stronger is. And if it can't do that, don't be surprised about the reaction of Jerusalem.
Thank you both very much for your time and for all of your observations and point of view. And I'm sure there will be more to come as we move forward with this government. We really appreciate your time and everybody on the phone and your questions as well, and look forward to talking again sometime in the not too distant future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for having us.
I apologize for my kids' interruption.
No worries.
no.
We forgot about it already.
Ken,
We
you're
forgot about it.
Thank you.
many more to interrupt us.
Okey-doke.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank